What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. It's Jacob Brewitt. Today we're going to be looking at how to mix a modern metal bass tone. The clip you just heard was from one of my upcoming songs called Hell Follows Me. If you like the clip, then be sure to subscribe so you can stay tuned to my upcoming music. So let's get into the video. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the amp sim that I chose, which is the Neural DSP Parallax. The nice thing about this is you have 3 bands to control your tone with. You have your low, your mid, and your high. The nice thing is you have a low compression here, which controls how much compression you want, and you can control where that cuts off, so the low pass, and you can control the level overall of the low end too. The mid distortion, so you have a mid band here, which is represented by this. It's at around 400 hertz, but you can control how much distortion is there and the level of that as well. So I had that set to about midway. Quite distorted, but I rolled off the level a little bit just so it gives that little bit of scoop. The high end, I have a little under halfway on the distortion. The high pass is almost 800 hertz, and I have it boosted here a little bit. So that's what the EQ curve looks like here. And you also have this equalizer down here. So this is where you can kind of really fine tune your EQ. On the next page, you have a cab sim, which is really nice too. Definitely experiment with that if you have this plugin. That about sums up the Parallax amp sim for the bass guitar. Let's move on. The next thing I have is a compressor, but it's not just any compressor. It is the Logic stock compressor. But what I have done is I have this on the bass track, and I have it in sidechain mode. And the sidechain is coming from the kick. So essentially what sidechain is you're taking the signal from a different source, and you're using that to compress this source, right? So I'm taking the kick drum to compress the bass. It's really quite intuitive, and it'll come in handy here, as we can see just in a second. So here are the settings that I have for the sidechain. These were default, the detection. The filter switched on. The EQ here, I have it around 90 hertz, and I have it in high pass mode with the Q a little bit over halfway. So what this is doing is you're picking out the low end of the bass guitar, and you're selecting the high pass for that, so that when the kick drum hits, you're ducking that bass end. And here are the settings I have on the compressor. Negative 30 dB, the threshold, 5:1 ratio. You're getting quite a bit of ducking. The attack I have to the fastest setting. The release is very quick as well, just so that way the kick drum is not completely ruining the bass guitar. And for this song specifically, the kick drum isn't extremely boomy, so you don't need to extend that release out more than it needs to be. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a listen to this specifically, the sidechain compression. I'm going to have it start with it off, and then I'm going to switch it on. So as you can hear, it's ducking that bass guitar just enough to let the full kick drum come through. We're getting 5 dB of gain reduction. That allows you to turn up your bass guitar without overwhelming the sub frequencies. Now we'll move on to the EQ that I have set up here. High pass at around 70. Again, just making room for the kick drum. We have a boost around 250 hertz, so that's letting the fundamental notes through. Here I have a cut around 450, just cutting some of the boxiness. Be sure to check around the area. Sometimes you don't even need to cut. I have a boost at around 4K, which is bringing up some of the clanginess and the presence, and then I'm cutting everything about 6.7K above that off. It's just a bunch of noise. The last and final thing I've done here is the DoubleTap by Submission Audio. This is a bass compressor. I really like it because you have here a control over your low compression and your low volume here, and then you have the overall compression. So once you dial in your low end compression, then you can compress your tone overall. You also have saturation here, which I have on the grunt setting, which is the more aggressive saturation on this plugin. Not so much as the EDM, because that's more for electronic music. Yeah, this is the settings that I have. It makes the bass sound nice and chunky. So that about sums up the plugins that I use. Just keep in mind that you want the bass to sit in the mix well, but not to overwhelm the sub frequencies that are usually taken up by the kick drum. You want the bass to basically be the foundation of your guitars in a metal mix specifically. What I like to do is I like to set the levels so that when you mute the bass, you completely lose the thickness from your guitar tone. When you turn it on and you listen to the song, you feel the bass, but you don't hear the bass over everything else, if that makes sense. So let's just do a quick recap of The tips that I showed you today, first off is balancing everything. Like I said, you kind of want the bass to fill in that low end of the guitars, but not overwhelm the subfrequencies where typically you have the kick drum. So when you mute the bass, the guitars lose all of their thickness, but when you bring the bass back in, it's not like you hear the bass over everything else. You want the bass to just be the thickness of the guitars, typically in a metal mix. Next, we discussed the tone, using that compression on the low end and driving the high end a little harder, cutting out some of those mids so that it sits well within the guitars and the kick drum. The next thing was the EQ that I applied afterwards, cutting off the super high ends because it's just too noisy, and a lot of the super sub frequencies cut at around 450 hertz to eliminate the boxiness. Next was the sidechain compression, so you're ducking the level of the bass guitar when the kick drum hits, so that way you can bring up the volume of the bass guitar and you're not overwhelming all the sub frequencies. The last thing was the last compressor, the DoubleTap, which I always use on the bass guitar. Just the final polish and the final compression to really tighten up the bass guitar, make everything sound nice and cohesive within the mix. So yeah, that about sums up my tips for you today on how to get a modern metal bass tone. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any suggestions, leave those in the comments below. Stay tuned for the next one. Be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.